Welcome to the Directing Animation Livecast with Scott Weiser. Now that I'm done directing the development and first episode of the second series of Space Station Animation, I'm joining up with Steamroller Animation to push the boundaries of the art form. Thanks to the support of so many of you, I'm continually developing more than 10 dynamic feature film pitches while mastering the art of telling deeply meaningful stories. Today we have Eric Elrod with us. If you don't know his work, you actually probably do know his work. He has been the director on Jurassic Park, Camp Cretaceous, Spiderman, the Amazing Spider-Man series. He's worked on Rio, the Peanuts movie. The list goes on and on and on. But where I encountered Eric was at the Salt Lake Animation Expo. He gave a speech about story structure. And I rarely find somebody else who compares and contrasts the story structure as much as I do. So it's awesome to hear his presentation, and I can't wait to dive in even deeper right now. Do you have anything to add to that, Eric? Or?
No, that's really flattering. I'm a huge nerd for story. Like, I love my favorite thing is just like taking it apart and putting it back together and seeing how everything works. And I just fill my head with random film story trivia. Because it's such a broad tapestry when it comes to storytelling. It's really like I find that there really is no there are ways that can generally be successful, and a lot of times that's simply because the audience has been trained to expect a certain structure just because they've been watching movies and TV and reading stories for so long.
Familiar, yeah.
It feels familiar, and familiar is good. Familiar makes happy, but you can make a perfect movie and it can fail, and you can make a horrible movie and it could become a, multi-billion-dollar franchise. So it's like, what are you gonna do?
It is true, yeah. Yeah, well, speaking of story, I'm gonna put in a little shameless plug here. Masked Magic, which I announced on the last show, it raised over $16,000 on Kickstarter and through private donations, and it's still available on BackerKit for pre-order through the month of September. So if you want to get that, you go to scottweiser.com/mass. You can hit pre-order and then select that and the other books that are on there. They're fantastic stories, and obviously the newest is the best. So, yeah, and thank you everybody for supporting that. That was a hugely successful campaign. I really loved it. So
awesome.
Okay, so I actually took a screenshot of your graphic. Your last graphic, because what you did in your presentation is you presented several different story structures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Save the Cat, and I think you did Robert McKee's story structure, and you did various story structures, and you used Matrix to show, like, if I take these points and I put them in a story, the story actually ends up radically different. Mm-hmm. And then you put up what you felt like was the best story structure. I'm going to put it up on screen here. You won't see it, but the audience will.
Which one was it?
It says Act 1, the setup, Act 2, transition, Act 3, resolution. And then you have Act 2 split in half, which is wise. That's what we do, right? And then you have Before the Journey, Walking the Path is Act 2, and Journey's End, Return is Act 3. And then you have what it does listed.
Yeah, and well, from my point of view, I have a strange point of view when it comes to storytelling in film and television, simply because my background and training is in, because I started in theater when I was 11 years old. So I spent 15 years studying theater. I went to college, my degrees in acting and directing in conservatory theater. And so when I look at a story, when I look at the structure, I am explicitly following the character, right? That seems like a does statement because we typically say like the character is the most important, but predominantly what we find is in story structure in film is like the character is following the plot versus the character driving the story. And so I'm typically looking, okay, this is the journey of this individual. And by that nature, this is the audience's journey, because a huge component of art that we sometimes seem to forget is the audience. Like, we are making this for them. We're making this from them to learn something, to feel something, to see something, to gain something, to lose something, some kind of catharsis, some kind of enlightenment. And so the structure of the story isn't just about building a plot.
Yeah.
It's about building a person, right?
Yes.
You take them as they are at the beginning. You put them through an experience that transforms them into something else by the end. And so that is the course of the story, and that is the nature of the narrative. And so often when we are looking at story structure, we're looking at the forms, right? These are the individual beats and this is what they look like, versus their function. These are the individual beats and this is what they do.
Yeah.
You know?
I love that. I love that. One of my favorite story structure people had him on the show. His name's Brian McDonald, goes and consults at different companies. And he talked about how he has an audience simulator in his mind. That he just runs the story through the audience simulator. And so he outlines and outlines and outlines, and then he writes one draft. Which is amazing. I don't know how he does that, but
he's just lots of dress rehearsals with those outlines, and that's I mean, he's got it just working through the burrs. I get it. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think he got that from Alfred Hitchcock. That's one of his big inspirations. And Alfred Hitchcock, they would say he would play the audience like a fiddle, right? And I always thought, well, does that mean he's manipulating them? And it's like, no. He understands what's going on in the audience's head, and he plays it. Holy cow, I've got to fly. But
I mean, but to a certain degree, even like you are manipulating the audience because you want to get them from point A to point C, D, E, F, G, in the course of the story. You want them to have this emotional journey. So to a certain degree, you have to understand how they're going to react to things in order to get them there. I was listening to Tom Hanks was talking about I can't remember what podcast he was on, but he was talking about like test screenings for the original King Kong back in the the 1930 version of King Kong. And he was talking about how in the test there was a sequence in the middle of the movie where the team is trying to save Fay Ray from King Kong on the island, and there's this one sequence where they're chasing after King Kong and they fall down into a spider's web, and a giant spider comes out and kills half the crew, right? And they had to cut the scene, even though it was compelling. They cut the scene because as soon as people see giant spider attacking people, they could care less about a 100-foot gorilla, right? That spider took away all of the danger of King Kong, and it's like, well, but you have to be aware that this is how the audience is going to react. They're always going to be more afraid of a spider than a gorilla, for one thing, because primates are more familiar. But the emotional tracking of the audience, if you want them to be afraid of this one thing and you do something that's worse, you have to take that thing out because you've now manipulated them in the wrong way. Yeah.
Well, I won't say what movie it was, but it was a sequel to a musical, and it
narrows it down.
What?
That narrows it down.
It does. But it was a certain sequel to a musical, and I remember we were only like we were less than 20 minutes in, and there was this huge musical number, and I was just like, how are they going to top that? And they never did. And it was just kind of interesting. Like, and then and this isn't the only reason, but there was another musical later on that I thought, this is so spectacular, so awesome. Why am I feeling nothing? And a lot of it did have to do with the story structure and the understanding that the filmmakers weren't connecting to the audience or to the characters.
Yeah. I mean, there's you could hide a lot of problems in a musical, because the music can be so much more emotionally effective than dialogue or action, and so because of that, the use of that, you can see where, like, if you take my always trick when I'm watching a musical is like, take all the music out, imagine taking it out and seeing if story still works. And quite a few of them break down. Quite a few of them stop.
A lot of them
working.
Do, Yeah, I have a project that nearly got funded a year ago, and we're still working on it. But it's a musical, and I at this point I grew up doing musical theater, but for me, if it's a musical, what?
Me too.
Yeah.
Hey.
If it isn't meant to be a musical, then make it a musical. And so this one was where I liked one thing. Some people complained there wasn't enough music in Coco, but I think that actually made it more effective because the music came where it needed to happen.
Yeah, and Coco's one of those movies where you can take the music out. Like, the music's beautiful, but you can take the music out and the story still works.
Absolutely.
I always point back to Mulan. Mulan is a super compelling story. The musical numbers are fantastic, but like, you don't need the music. You don't. It plays solid either way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
I hadn't actually thought about that one. I do, when I'm analyzing a musical, I do cut out the music and then look at just the story structure. I definitely do that. But I love how you said you can hide a lot of problems in a musical. This
Yeah.
is so true.
You can hide a lot of problems in spectacle as well. You can hide a lot of problems in humor. There's plenty of movies where or franchises where it's these big high concept, super fantastical worlds, and it's very rare that I actually sit down to watch those because I know that they're going to be hiding a lot of the problems behind giant CG spectacle scenes, and I'm like, it's just not for me, you know.
Yeah, I'm there with you. And when I do watch
So
them, it's actually fun to break them apart and explain to the person like this is where it all fell apart and
I
this
get
is
in
how you
trouble for
can
doing
make
that.
it better. I know I do
Yeah.
too. I had a reputation one place. It's like don't talk to Scott about that. Maybe he'll ruin it for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
but
My I get in trouble watching movies with my wife because she sees I'm quiet and she just assumes that I hate the movie and she's like,
oh
"What's
no,
wrong with it?" I'm like, "There's nothing wrong with it."
nothing.
I mean, to be fair, there isn't anything wrong with it because those films and those shows still have an effect on their audience. They exist because they have a fan base. They exist because people tune in to watch them, and so therefore, even though they're not my choice, they are successful because people continue to click on them and watch them.
Oh, that's a
But
good perspective. I
I
mean, actually, there's no perfect film out there either, right?
No,
So
no, there's no perfect film. There's films that work better. There's films objectively work better than others, but it really is just like a to each his own because the audience, you
yeah,
know, it's the audience's thing, and if the audience loves it, then it is theirs. Part of the danger of like when you think about Star Wars when they started rewriting the lore and the fans freaked out. Other than the fact that Star Wars fans tend to be more rabid than other fan bases, but they've had ownership of it. Once you put it out there, it belongs to the audience and they have their opinions and you start messing with their dogma, they get a little upset, you know?
yeah.
So I had the same thing in college with like Shakespeare nerds when people start messing with Shakespeare. I'm just like, Shakespeare's a musical without the music. So it's like you can play with it a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting. Musical without the music. I
But
never heard. I've done a lot of Shakespeare, but and you
yeah,
have
when you
iambic pentameter and you have
yeah,
fancy
there are the
language.
there are the beats, there are the sections of the story that are all written in prose, and then when you get to a moment of like profound emotion or event, he switches into the meter, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like you'll usually see it like Act 3, Scene 1 is when a big soliloquy will happen, and it will be in the meter.
yeah,
And that's because they've gotten to a place where they kind of have to start singing a little bit. They're just not singing yet, but it has that instinct in it. It has that kind. The rhythm of the meter helps convey the emotion, helps convey the sensibilities to the audience.
yeah.
You
I
know.
was in a show called As You Like It in college,
Hmm.
and they have songs written in there, but usually they'll just have somebody come in and recite it, right?
Yeah.
The character I played was the guy who recited it, but they actually wrote it as music and had a Celtic band
Awesome.
come in. I got these little clacking spoon things, and oh, it was fun. It was
Nice.
so fun.
Nice.
And actually, it was really
Nice.
impactful because one of the songs happened when one of the characters dies,
Mm.
and so we were able to invoke tears in a way that I don't think you would have invoked without music.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I can imagine there was probably sheet music that was written by some minstrel in the players or the troupe that just didn't get saved. I mean, we barely have Shakespeare's plays. That was like a Herculean effort by his contemporaries several years after his death to just try and collect enough of what they remember and what they still had to create the folio.
yeah,
It's like it's a twist of fate that we actually still have, that we even know who Shakespeare is, that we have any of his plays.
yeah. That is so okay. I had a thought
Okay.
about musicals. Like you can hide musicals. Do you think you could hide a bad film in a soundtrack too? Because a soundtrack is kind of like a score for a film is kind of like a new screenplay, kind of on top of your screenplay.
Yeah. There's plenty of movies where like you have like needle drop kind of, jukebox soundtracks and like, because those songs will have an emotional, value to them, to the audience already, especially if you do something that has nostalgia value to it, like people are going to connect to it and bring their own emotions to those scenes that might not already be present. And that's why it can sometimes be a little bit dangerous to do that because
You
what the
might get a
director
bad
feels.
association.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that was the thing is like, there's a lot of times when one of my first notes I always give when we do stories, when we give like story notes in studios, is when they start to kind of rely too much on archetype and say, oh, because they're father, daughter, or mother, son, obviously they would do a certain thing. It's like, not everybody has the same relationship with their parents. Some people don't have that parent in their life. And so like you're to just rely on the fact that they are family, you're going to lose the reason why, and it's going to be an intellectual connection that the audience has to it. Like they're just going to assume archetypally. Is that a word?
Archetype.
Archetypically,
Yeah.
archetypically. I don't know. Grab somebody in the notes will tell us, and I'll learn something new today.
I don't know.
But the emotional connection won't be there. So it's like always like, even though yes, they are mother, daughter, father, son, whatever relationship you have, you still have to make me be a part of that relationship and feel that relationship and understand that relationship.
You'd have to see that these are the dynamics of the relationship first before you show this dynamic, so that the audience can feel it, because they've already become that character along the way.
You still have to do that work, even if those two people are complete strangers. You still have to do that work with the audience so that they get there, so that they understand. So that you get to create the intimacy.
One of my favorite scenes that nobody ever sees, Brian McDonald pointed it out, to give him credit, but is in Close Encounters. You have a scene where he's driving along, and there's a car that comes behind him, and he waves the car past, right? And then another car comes behind him, but then it moves up. And because they had shown the car before it, it has more emotional impact. And filmmakers don't think to do that. They're like, "Oh, skip to the good part. Skip to the meat." But it's like, no. People won't like the meat if they don't understand, the context of the meat.
The one I always point to, like, it's very, you're absolutely right on that. You really have to give the audience the time to understand. One of the scenes I always point to, there's a couple of scenes I always point to. Because we do have to be like, let's keep the plot moving forward. Keep the plot moving forward. If they made like Raiders of the Lost Ark today, say somebody else had Final Cut other than Spielberg, right? My favorite scene would not be in the movie. My favorite scene is the scene with Marion and Indy on the boat, and she's like, "You're not the man I knew 20 years ago or 10 years ago." And he says, "It's not the age, it's the mileage." It's just the two of them. Has nothing to do with the larger plot. Has nothing to do with the Nazis or the Ark. It's just the two of them. And it's just like that little scene of those two together and their relationship. And it's just about just their relationship to each other and our feelings about them as the audience with them and how much we care about them. Nothing to do with the plot. It's gone because it doesn't advance the plot. It's just this little island of character that's just so beautiful. Plus it's also like, if I was going to point to a line of dialogue that encapsulates everything that Indiana Jones is, it's that line. It's like, it's not the age, it's the mileage. That thing, like, that was Harrison Ford saying, "This is me telling you who I am." But the other scene I would point to is in Father of the Bride, like the first Steve Martin Father of the Bride, not the original, but there's a scene in the first act, after you meet the fiance, or after the his daughter says, "I'm getting married," he's like, "You can't, you're too young," and there's a giant blow up at the dinner table. There's a little scene between George and his daughter that you could lift out of the movie and the story would still make sense, because the very next scene you meet the fiance and blah blah blah. The scene is just George playing basketball with his daughter. It's just the two of them playing basketball in the little court that's in front of the garage. And it's you get the sense that this is a ritual that they've had for 20 years. Like, they've been doing this the entire course of their relationship. And because of that, you see how much he loves her, how much he means to her, how much she means to him. You see, like, you understand just how much why George is having such a problem letting his daughter go. And it saves his character, because then he could be an asshole for the rest, excuse me, language. He could be a jerk for the rest of the movie, and you forgive him for it because, like, no, I get it, because, like, that is so precious. And that scene isn't about as much George and his daughter and their relationship. It's the scene where the audience falls in love with the relationship. It's the scene where the audience gets emotionally invested in this pairing. And so in that point, we empathize with George.
It's interesting you said you could cut that scene out and it would make sense. But it wouldn't. I don't know that it would have the emotional impact. And so
no, and that's the thing.
It's logic. We're not building things with logic here when we're building movies.
We're building stories with emotion.
Is fairly important, but theme beats logic.
Yes.
And I think one reason that executives tend to want to cut these kinds of things is they've seen the movie and they see the emotional impact it has, and they're like, get to the good stuff, and they think, oh, we could just trim this thing. But it's like, no. You've seen the movie. So the movie with that scene in it. You cut that scene, you're going to lose so much. if you're a good writer.
Yeah.
You know, some scenes can deserve to be cut, but
Because there's this dogmatic belief that you have to keep the plot moving forward. And it's like, well, the plot just tells you what happens, but it doesn't tell you why it matters. And that's the storytelling part of it, right? And you need these little moments to kind of help us get there, you know? And yeah, sometimes it slows the movie down a little bit, but it pays off huge in the course of the story, in the course of viewing the movie, you know?
yeah.
So.
I love it. I love it. There's another scene too that I think of in Prince of Egypt where, you know, you've had all the plagues come and the filmmakers were wise enough to take this really a slow moment of Moses walking down the stairs and then he collapses crying. And I just think that the film without that would be half as good to me, you know, with that one little scene. And it's so slow and
the first half of that scene is in the first act when it's Moses and Ramses acting like brothers, right? And how far Ramses will go to protect Moses and love Moses and be like, just how much that relationship between those two men matter and how much love they share with each other. Just the Ramses fall and Moses's guilt has so much more resonance because you set that up at the beginning, that they have this love and this bond and this connection that matters to them as human beings, you know, even though they end on opposite sides of this war, you know, it's so much more painful. But that's beautiful, you know.
Yeah, it is.
Pain is big because the catharsis is wonderful, you know, that emotional journey is wonderful for us to have.
It's interesting too. I was thinking about this on my run the other day. In college, I was taking a creative writing class, I think, and they talked about suffering that all these artists went through and these poets and writers and all sorts. And I don't know why, but I was like, oh, I think I can do it without the suffering. Why should you have to suffer for your art? That just sounded so weird to me. But the older I get, the more I'm like, oh no, I think that, you know, a good story takes pain to write.
Yeah.
And good insight, deep meaning takes painful experience, you know.
You have to live your life. You have to experience life in order to understand like the breadth of this emotional tapestry that we have access to.
Awesome.
You know?
Well, that was a fun tangent. We actually, I promised that we would kind of go over this chart and
sure, yeah.
We started going on other things.
This is how our brains work because we're story nerds.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much to talk about each little subject. You could just go on for hours, right?
Yeah.
So here I have Act 1 and what it does. What you'd written was it sets the scene and gets the ball rolling. It gives the setting. It gives the sense of tone and expectation. It introduces the primary characters. It introduces the primary conflict. It introduces stakes. And then something happens, which is the inciting incident. Act 2, is there anything you want to say about that act?
That's exactly what I wrote.
Yeah, that's exactly what you wrote.
What I always say in that point is that it doesn't take as much work as you think, because I've seen so many movies where the first act goes on for 1,000 years because there's setting up the world and setting up the characters and setting up the rules and setting up the magic. It's like every single character has to have an introduction. It's like there's a lot that the audience will get through context. You know, there's a lot that they'll get. There's a lot that they'll get on the journey, you know, and it's like they're pretty savvy. And if you tell them too much, then they're gonna fall asleep because they're just you want to leave them something to dig for and something to work for a little bit, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I think what we're doing here is we're giving them umbrellas, right?
Yeah.
We're saying, okay, here's the umbrella. Everything fits under that, so you can't go outside that umbrella, but you don't have to explain the umbrella entirely in the first act. That's laying too much pipeline, is what they call it in Save the Cat, right?
Yeah.
So I love how you split Act 2 in two parts. A lot of people don't do it, and that middle point is really a fulcrum. So the first part of Act 2 there will be growth and discoveries. In Save the Cat, you have the fun and games part, right? You enter a new world. You prepare the protagonist to achieve their goals. So it's a kind of a preparation period. Their tests, growth, learning, and struggle. Their intro guides and love interests. So
intro to guides and love interests.
Like any people, who guide them. And then you introduce a B plot, if there is one, or a supporting plot. Did you write S plot?
Yeah, supporting plot.
Yeah, I like supporting plot a lot better than B plot. Definitely. And then it's generally lighter than the second half, obviously, because you're continually getting more and more heavy as you go toward the climax, right?
Generally so, yeah. But there's also an inverted arc, which tragedies follow a lot, where the first half is going to be heavier and darker than the second half, and it
Oh,
just depends on what the character's going through and what their story is.
oh, I love that.
The reason why there's so much prep work in the first half of the second act is because this is a brand new experience for this person. They don't know anything, or maybe they do. Maybe they know some stuff, but they still have to learn something. They still have to grow. They still have to gain. They still have to find. They still have to work. You know,
And in a
and
tragedy, they're going to not grow, and so
no,
you make it
they're going to
lighter
push
toward the
against.
end.
It gets lighter towards, and that's what creates the tragedy at the end. Is because where the moment when they're supposed to learn, they've had such a light beat, like this becomes one of their easiest moments, that they're like, oh well, I guess I don't have to change because
Oh,
things are getting better. You
that's
know,
so cool. I
but
love
that's what I mean. Like
we don't have
the
many
inverted thing,
tragedies to analyze these days, so
but some stories will still use that tragic mellow, like Cars and Good Will
oh,
Hunting will use the inverted model because they're so resistant to change in the first half that they're not really learning and growing. They're not really changing. They're kind of like, I'm finding a status quo, kind of a balance with what I want to be, stay as what I want, but kind of being able to function in this environment. But they're not changing until they hit the midpoint. Then, like, okay, now I've given a reason to change, and they will start to grow up.
oh, interesting.
And so that
I wish
is
they did
the
that.
invert. The learning happens in the second half.
Insert the
The
solitude I
changing
did.
happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because she's so
So it
resistant to
just
change. Yeah.
yeah, and so it's just a question of like where, because the characters that are willing to go, the characters that are willing to change and are kind of proactive, to use, I mean, it's an aggressive word because some of them aren't as proactive, but the ones that are open to the experience will do that learning and growing on the first half because
Interesting.
they're like, I need, because what will happen is like, that's the thing I need to do, or that's my goal. I need to get there. There's a little bit of self-awareness that like I don't have the ability to get there, so I'll have to do some work to do that, right? So you'll see like, I point to like the Karate Kid. He's got to win. He's got to win the All Valley tournament against Cobra Kai.
Yeah.
I don't know any karate. I better start learning. Um, Will Turner in Pirates of the Caribbean does not have one clue whatsoever about how to save Elizabeth. So now he's like learning all of these pirate skills from Jack Sparrow unintentionally because he needs Jack's help. But like he's doing all of these new things that he would not have done if not for this situation because he needs to do that in order to save Elizabeth.
That's
You
awesome.
know, that's when they start. But conversely, Lightning McQueen thinks he's fine. He's awesome. He's a
Yeah.
great. He's a superstar. He's the best in the world. Why should I change? Until like little thing after little thing after little thing after little thing keeps bringing him down, bringing him down, bringing him down, bringing him down, into a point where like something makes him change. Something like, hey, maybe I'm not on the right path.
Interesting. I love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the second part of Act 2 follows a false victory or a defeat. So it can either be an up moment or a down moment, and often in Save the Cat, he says that right before the climax, you'd have the opposite of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
This seems like the toughest act to write, or the toughest part to write. The second part of Act 2, and it's interesting now. I don't know if it's to my detriment, but I tend to really plan that area. Like,
Yeah.
I really focus in and make sure that I've got that solid, and then I plan everything around it. What do you think of that? Does that sound good? Does that sound bad to you?
I mean, it's tricky only because like you want to get to that moment at the end of the second act where the character has a moment of reflection, right? That's the Dark Night of the Soul scene. That's the atonement scene, atonement with the Father, where the character has to kind of take a look at who they are, where they're going, where they've been, right? That's like it's the reason why, like in my lecture, it points back. The reason why they go on this journey in the first place is tied to this moment, right? Because and it's tied to the midpoint because the midpoint gives them that little sense of victory. They do something that makes them feel either successful, usually successful in most stories. If it's a defeat, then it's like, well, it's somewhat validating their bad think in this moment. But you have to get them to a place where they stop and go, okay, like I've learned this much, I've gone this far, I've suffered these burdens, I've made these mistakes, what do I do? Do I continue going forward? Which path do I choose? Do I choose the path of growth that I've been on? Or do I choose to like revert back to where I was at the beginning? This is the tragedy arc, and say, oh wait, no, this was a mistake from the start. I was better back then, you know? And so it's like, it's kind of, and that in itself is setting up the third act, because the third act is prove it, right? It's like put your money where your mouth is. The third act is like they've made a choice at the end of the second act to say which path I'm on. And it's like, okay, stick to it. Do you really mean this? And then the movie's going to throw everything it possibly can at them to try and break them down and throw them off their path. And it's like them finding that they have either the ability or the will or the desire to hold true to it, you know, even if it means that their destruction, you know, or if on the tragedy arc, they make the wrong choice and they're destroyed by it because like, oh, wait, you didn't learn fast enough. So it's poison, Romeo. So it is tricky, but if you know where your character starts, you know what's in their heart and what they want in the first act, you know, and you know how they need to end up, you can kind of start to track those beats emotionally within the character to get you there, you know, because I think a lot of times for like when we're thinking about like how to write these beats, we're thinking about this cool scenes and how they're being like, or how do I make them cry versus like the reason why those scenes need to be there, you know, because like I point to in the Matrix, that moment isn't like we assume those beats are supposed to be dark and dramatic, but like in the Matrix, it's not. It's an intellectual moment. It's a logical moment where like Neo's like, hold on a second. Morpheus said this thing, and then the Oracle said this other thing, and now it's all coming true. This can't possibly be true. You know, it's like he has to make a choice about like what path do I follow? You know, and it's like it's really just him going, and his whole arc is what can you believe? And so it's that moment is him going like, okay, I've been a skeptic for this long. Now I need to have a moment of faith. You know.
Yeah.
You know, in Pirates of the Caribbean, that moment comes earlier in the second act, because if we're following Will's story, his moment of like reflection happens before the pirates even show up and they get marooned, right? Because he's that one moment where he realizes like, whoa, I actually really am a pirate. I have pirate's blood in my veins. And it's during a sweet moment between him and Elizabeth, you know? And so it's like, it's really just kind of figuring out what your character needs to get them there, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It all focuses on that internal journey of the character.
Yeah, and the audience's journey with them. Yeah. And the audience's journey with them. So
Act 3 seems like it should be the easiest act to write, right? You just wrap up the conflict, resolve it. You can kind of return back to you were at the beginning to show how the character's changed, or you can move on to some other new existence depending on what the story is. But you know, you can go too long, you can be too short as well. Are there any other pitfalls that we should avoid in Act 3?
I mean, 3 is like, because I've seen some really long third acts. Like Return of the King is like 4 hours long. I think a lot of times that one is just like, because you can do that kind of fun, like really showing off your world building that you did it, like if you saved it from the first act, you know, and just kind of let it kind of blow up there. Part of it is also like just how much is the audience willing to sit through? Like how far do you need to go before the audience is like, okay, I got it already. I got it. You can stop now, you know? Sometimes you want to take that extra time. Like Jaws, the third act, I think it's like 15 minutes. It's like really, really short. And it's enough. He's like, the shark eats the boat. And you're like, well, I get it. I don't need the boat to come back up from the bottom and go through it twice. It's like you just, you know, it can just be that short, you know, versus like A New Hope. I think it's like 45 minutes. It feels really long, the third act in New Hope. Maybe it just feels long. I don't have to go look at the time code on that one. But yeah, it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The third act is really short and it's really small. Like you think about like, well, Endgame, the third act is the last hour of the movie. Avengers Endgame. That's as soon as like they come back with the stones and like they're mourning, you know, spoilers, but the movie's like 10 years old. Widow's Loss. That's the start of the third act, and it's like more than an hour. It's like a third of the running time of the movie. The first act of Endgame is really, really short. It's really because they don't have to do any work setting stuff up. So it's
Right.
like it's all second and third act, and it's really long, but you know, it's
They were
fun.
telling a lot of stories there.
Yeah.
They had
But
a
I don't know
lot to write.
that last battle is super fun. It's like it pays off 10 years of movie making, you know? So it's like
Yeah.
I don't mind too much, you
Yeah.
know. I there's a great YouTube series called Just Right that I love. Really fun, kind of insightful looks at filmmaking. Like every look, even my look and your look and the professionals quote unquote look at filmmaking, it's all subjective. It's all our
Yeah.
own personal interpretation.
Uh-huh.
Um, but like he makes a compelling argument about how the first act of Rocky is an hour. You know, the movie's barely two, but it's all first act because he spends so much time setting up Rocky. If you're tracking the plot point that the story is Rocky becomes a boxer, right? Because
Hmm.
the offer to box Apollo Creed doesn't show up until an hour into the movie. So the rest of all of that other stuff is just setting up who he is, how he feels about things, his hopes and dreams, his meeting of Adrian, you know. So if you're looking at through that lens of just his boxing career, yeah, it's an hour. You know,
Yeah.
if you're looking at it through the lens of like Rocky's personal journey, then the first act is fairly short because
Then
as soon
it's
as he
the
meets
same.
Adrian,
Yeah.
it's the same general structure, and then you get to the midpoint becomes the offer for the boxing ring, and it's like that for the boxing Apollo,
Yeah.
like, and that still kind of makes sense for that. You know, you look at his arc switches from being a positive arc to kind of an inverted V, you
Yeah.
know, but it is all just how you personally feel about it. You know,
Wow.
you can make the same argument
It's a
about
Wonderful
Jurassic
Life.
Park.
Yeah, it's a Wonderful Life's that way too. Like people
Yeah,
know that as the movie of this guy getting to see life without him, but
yeah,
that doesn't happen till about 2/3 of the way into the movie, right? And
yeah,
but obviously the arc is about his personal journey and not
yeah,
just what the angel's doing. The angel has his own part in the story, but Terrence, I guess, is his name.
yeah.
So the interesting thing is, like, as I was thinking about this and story structure and comparing all these story structures, I have started to thinking about this less as structure and more as
Mhm.
dynamics.
Yeah. Interesting.
Dynamics that fit, and it seems like that's what we've been talking about, is different dynamics
Hmm.
that hang in a structure, but they are switchable and they're moldable depending on what the character is going through. If you're doing it right, you don't have too much molding power, right? You're the slave of your story, not the master. But depending on what your specific character's journey is, you can use different dynamics to make the story work for the
Yeah,
audience.
to a degree, yeah. I mean, the danger with that, only I would is that
Yeah, push back. I love that.
because like I've seen this kind of happen is where like you're trying to that's where you talk about having a song where in the middle of the movie that was bigger than the rest of the movie,
Uh huh.
and it's just like because they really like this idea and like well I just can't get rid of it, and so it just kind of blows up the middle of the movie. Um, what can happen sometimes is that you get so in love with like a plot idea or a set piece, um, that it stays where it is, even though you've done all this work in the first act or the third act that makes that plot piece point feel unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
And so the characters are forced to go through a thing that doesn't feel natural
Yeah.
just because the plot needs them to. Like,
Yeah.
so they'll make a choice or they'll say a thing or they'll act in a certain way that seems incongruent with where their journey is or what they've been doing just because they want a certain thing to happen, you know? Um,
Yeah.
I see it a lot of times with like TV shows that don't end very well because they really wanted something to happen at the end of the show. Um, and like you've gone on this journey with these characters and you've gotten to know them very well and you've gotten invested in who they are and what they're going through and what they want to be. And all of a sudden, weird stuff just happens. And all of a sudden, all of those things that you were meant to believe are thrown away because they really want this plot thing to happen,
Yeah.
you
At the
know?
same time, I think
And
we're
it's like,
talking about another dynamic. You know,
yeah, well,
there's this
yeah.
other
And
dynamic that if you're trying to use one dynamic, but you start to feel it's unnatural for the character, there's another dynamic that lets you know that, right?
yes,
Is what it's saying.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. So it's like I always feel like the characters will kind of tell you where they're going, and if you need them, you can prod them. That's what's great about supporting characters and supporting subplots or B plots is that you have these other people that kind of like tap them in a direction if you need them to,
Yeah.
because what happens is the character will either really care about that other person's opinion or feelings or have a need for them in their lives, and that person will push back,
Right.
and the character will have to evaluate, okay, am I doing something wrong? Am I going the wrong way? Have I screwed up in some way? And it'll course correct them a little bit, you know,
Awesome.
because
Okay.
they're human beings and they care about their relationships,
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna really take a hard left here,
Okay.
because this is something I wanted to focus on, and if we keep going, we won't get to it. But it's
Okay.
really cool, and it has to do with you in particular, because you aren't the person
Okay.
writing these screenplays. You aren't the
Mm.
person writing these stories. You're storyboarding, right?
Yeah.
And something I noticed is on this series that I was developing at Space Station Animation, this second one, I noticed, well, we were writing these scripts and they were very wordy because this is a YouTube celebrity. He
Mhm.
loves to speak. He's just a big talker and he's really good at it, right? And we had
Mhm.
all these other social media influencers we're bringing in. We came in a room and they rewrote every single line in the script, right? Like, how would you say it? How would your character say it?
Mhm.
And that was an interesting meeting to be a part of because I was sitting there going, but the structure, but the characters, And so I had to kind of help steer them into the direction like, that's a good idea. You said it just a little bit more this way, it would help your character arc and stuff,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. But then one thing that was interesting is we came out of that meeting, we recorded everything, and I looked at the screenplay and I was like, we still need work here. This still needs some structure. This still needs the dynamics that make a really good story. And I realized, oh, well, we can do that with the visuals.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to talk to you about that. Like how much of this structure you're able to bring into the process with your storyboarding.
It's that's usually like one of the first things I try and do when I get in my assignments is trying to figure out like what is the focus of this scene, because the
Mm-hmm.
scene has to advance their story in some way.
Yeah.
It has to take them closer to where they're going or away from where they're going, in some constructive way. Even if it's like destructive, even if they take them backwards, it's in some way it sheds some either bad thought or bad practices that makes the character ready to move forward,
Yeah.
or it reinforces some bad thoughts or bad methods that makes them basically be destroyed by the end of the story. So um, there is a degree where you can have a fun jive section like that,
Mm-hmm.
where like it's kind of they're improvising off each other, and like there's a lot of those movies where like scenes go on for a long time and
Yeah.
they're super fun because the characters are super witty, or
Mm-hmm.
the relationship is really great.
Yeah.
um and that's one of those things where like sometimes you let it go long because you don't know in the board process how much you need, you know, and you'll find out in editorial, like, okay, now it's starting to feel long because in the context of everything else, it feels like it's way too much.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes like it will go long because like you've got this movie has been so fast and so heavy and there's so much information, there's so many events. It's really nice to just kind of pause for a minute and let these characters just kind of yak at each other,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And it's like I don't mind, I'll just let them talk for a little bit, So it's like there's the on the macro sense, like what do you need for the overall story and the overall experience of the audience?
Yeah.
And then on the micro sense, okay, well, what is the purpose of this scene? And
Yeah.
sometimes you'll discover during the creative process that the purpose of the scene shifts, you
Yeah.
know? Maybe it was important to advance some character or some relationship or some plot idea. And sometimes, oh wait, no, it's just about us growing to love these people. And it's more about the audience than it is about the characters themselves.
Yeah.
You know? One of my mentors always said, be open to discovery, you
Yeah.
know? Have a direction you're going, but allow space for the magic to kind of happen that you might not be aware is supposed to be there,
Yeah.
and let the process find it for you, you know?
Yeah. Your approach kind of sounds familiar. I mean, you're both pros. So Glenn Harmon was on the show
Ah,
a
Glenn.
few years ago, and he said he had this acronym TCBY, like for the
Yeah.
ice cream, right? And T was tent poles, like your big things that have to happen in this
Yeah.
sequence. And then he had the TCC was camera, like where you put your camera has a lot of meaning, and how
Hmm.
it's staged, right? And then the blocking, what the characters are doing, and then YouTube for reference, which is like the discovery, like the surprise.
Yeah.
How do I find something surprising in life
Yeah.
that helps inspire this scene and make this scene more
Yeah.
interesting and dynamic?
Glenn's a genius. I,
He
I've,
is.
I've, I've worked with him before. He's fantastic. And like, and that's a good point when we talk about the camera work too, is that your camera can either be passive and just show you the event, or it could say, it can really influence the audience's opinion,
Yeah.
And so it's like thinking about how you can use that artistically is fantastic, you know. And even sometimes just letting the camera back off and get out of the
Oh yeah,
way,
yeah. Just be there.
you know,
Yeah.
just be there, you know, because I whenever I tell my students, I say the audience, the camera is you. You're the audience member. Like you're the person. Imagine yourself physically in this space with these people. How close do you want to get? You know,
Yeah.
where do you want to be? What do you want to look at? What is the most interesting thing to you? You know,
Yeah, I like that.
and it's you know, and like that's kind of what I feel like. You know, when I one of my earliest interest because I'm old, like Spielberg, early Spielberg. I love because his use of camera is always like you really get a sense of like this is Spielberg just like, all right, this is cool. And it's just him looking around and like looking at stuff and just it's like when he introduces Marion in Raiders, it's just a wonder. He's just like comes into the whiskey glasses and he's just looking back and forth at these two people and like I could just imagine he's just grinning the whole time because like
Yeah.
this is amazing, you know.
Yeah.
And the scene feels that way, you know, because it's his personality coming through watching this moment unfold.
Yeah.
So
I love that. So my last question that I usually do in every show is the get wiser moment. And the question is, if my
yeah.
goal is to get the highest concentration of truth into a story, what approach would you recommend? It sounds like we've already started answering this. It sounds like you would recommend really focus on the character and what that character is going through and making sure you're truthful with that experience. Is there anything you'd like to add on top of that?
Like being sincere with it. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a certain amount where like you yourself have to be vulnerable as the writer, I mean, actors are always told be vulnerable, be open,
Yeah.
you know, show us what's underneath, be raw. But it's not really something that gets communicated to like the directors and the board artists as much because they're always like, oh no, we can step back and be reserved. It's like, well, no,
No,
it's
you got
like
to be vulnerable.
you have to be
Yeah.
you yourself still have to show, you yourself have to be open up, you yourself have to try things, you yourself have to take some risks with like, you know, you're going to put yourself out there. You're everything that you do is you're putting yourself out there for scrutiny, right? And so sometimes people will start to make the safe choices because like I don't want to be judged too much. It's like, well, no, that's when the walls come up. That's when the artifice comes involved. Like break through that and try and find something sincere and meaningful that's inside of you that you can impart through these moments because you're trying to take these people, you're trying to take your audience into your life. You're trying to impart your own personal experiences
Yeah.
onto them because we all of our points of views are completely unique and different, and the only way we can understand somebody else's life is by walking it with them. And so it's like
Oh, yeah.
letting these people in so that they can and find those little moments, let them be uncomfortable, you know, for a little bit,
Yeah.
you know. That's what I kind of feel like when we talk about like truth, you know, and sincerity, is that like trying to get underneath the artifice a little bit more
Yeah.
and bringing out like what is actually going on.
Yeah.
Even the broken ugly stuff sometimes is still
Oh, it
beautiful
is
in
beautiful.
bringing that out, you know.
Yeah. I've started saying a lot, we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into these projects. We better make it worth it, you know.
Yeah.
We better make the
Yeah.
discovery, whatever you're discovering, whatever you're inventing there, it's got to be worth it.
Yeah,
Um,
my friend always called like animated films $1 million $1 million a minute movie because it costs about $1 million per minute of footage.
mhm.
Um, and I was like, yeah, you might as well do the best stuff that you can,
Yeah.
which is quite often ends up being like in film the safest stuff because it is so costly. But if you can
Yeah, yeah, it
find,
is generally the safest stuff, yeah.
you know, and plot stuff and spectacle stuff are really easy. Character stuff takes a lot more work. Character stuff takes a lot more insight. Character stuff takes a lot more risk and vulnerability.
And pain.
But it's and pain and
Yeah.
joy, you
And
know, and
joy, yes,
sadness.
because you when you feel that depth of pain, there's your heart is then bigger to
Yeah,
contain the joy. Yeah. So,
yeah.
yeah.
But the joy feels more if you go through the pain.
Yes,
You
exactly.
know, you can't have relief unless you suffer first. So
Yes, exactly. Oh, it's been awesome having you on the show. If anybody wants to follow you, where's the best place to follow you? Your work or
uh,
connect with you?
I have my website, thehouseofelrod.com.
Okay.
And I'm just on social media, you know, Instagram, you know, I LinkedIn, I generally reply back to messages. It's like always, I got, I love talking about this stuff. It's one of my favorite things in the world. I drive my family crazy.
Me too.
But also it's just like it's just nice to kind of like I started out just, I was a PA and I just fell in love with storyboarding, and like I was lucky enough to be surrounded by people who didn't just look at me as like, oh no, this is an impossible thing, might as well give up. Like they gave me help and feedback. They spent their time talking to me and kind of giving me advice, and I always try and kind of pay that forward, just because there's so many incredible points of view and so many incredible artists who just kind of need that little bit of help just to kind of let their voice come out. And for me, I feel like it's just kind of a richer world when we have more people playing with us,
Yeah.
in this, in the creative sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. I had the same philosophy. So yeah, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.
Until next time, I hope we all get a little wiser. Thank you for watching the Directing Animation Livecast, hosted by Scott Weiser. Audio version edited by Kira Horowitz. Copyright Scott Weiser LLC 2022. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and ring that notification bell.